Hello everyone, the Altibox Norway tournament started yesterday, and one of the most interesting things about it is that we get to see Magnus Carlsen play against Fabiano Caruana once again before their World Championship match in November. And after the Grenke Classic, where I would say their play was kind of equal, and when Fabiano was playing the US Championship and Magnus was playing the Shamkir in the Gashimov Memorial, where the competition was indirect, now they finally got to play a game themselves once again, and I think that this game was very significant for the outcome of the World Championship match, and it was the only decisive result in round one of the Altibox Norway. The setup is extremely strong, of course. It's Magnus Carlsen, Fabiano Caruana, Maxim Bashir Legrave, Levon Aronian, Shahriar Mamediyarov, Dinglir, and Wesley So. Vishy Anand, Hikaru Nakamura. I think that's it. Perhaps I missed somebody, but basically the 10 strongest players in the world. And in round one, everybody drew except for Magnus and Fabiano. And Magnus had the white pieces. He opened with pawn to e4. We have e5, and now not knight to f3, the standard opening going into the Spanish, the Italian, or something else, but once again bishop to c4, which he played this year already, and it's an opening he sometimes does play against e5, the bishop's opening. Now, of course, this is not as solid as the Spanish or the Italian, but it's nonetheless it's a good opening for white. So knight to f6, d3, and of course Fabiano Caruana was prepared for this because he knows it's in Magnus's repertoire. c6, knight to f3, d5. Now this could be called some kind of weird Italian. This could transpose from some kind of Italian, but this is now called the Berlin defense, but not the one after knight to f6 in the Spanish, but the one in the bishop's opening. And it's supposed to be equal. You can see the evaluation on the right side of the board. The position is almost all zeros. And it's been played about 300 times before in Grandmaster games. Now bishop to b3, of course, bishop b4 check. Bishop to e7 is a more common move, just preparing to castle, not going for an exchange of bishops, but bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and now a5. This move is kind of unusual, and it's aggressive, but it's only been played once or twice, perhaps 5 or 6 times, I'm not sure, but not that many times played, and usually black would castle here or develop the bishop or develop the knight. So it's very aggressive, and it's of course asking the bishop to move right away or to make some room for itself. You could play a3, but playing c3 is stronger, I believe, with the normal Spanish plan of bringing the knight to c2. Magnus plays c3, knight b to d7, and here is the first novelty of the game. Usually white castles here, that's the most common move. E takes d5 has never been played. And once again the position is equal. cd5, castles, rook to e1, normal development, rook e8, knight f1, the standard Spanish plan of bringing the knight from d2 to f1 to g3 to control the f5 square, or to e3 to control d5 and f5. Now knight to f1, and here Fabiano Caruana plays aggressively. He plays b5, which is an imprecise move, but practically speaking, I think it's good for black. And Magnus reacts equally aggressively with the a4, and provoking Fabiano either to capture or to close down the files. And now after b4, c4, a takes b4, white has a passed pawn. And the provocation worked. Of course, the position is not that much better for white, but having a passed pawn means something. Of course, Magnus had to concede to a few weaknesses here, but in a short while the pawn is going to become strong, or it could become strong. Now we have knight to e3, not bringing the knight to g3 but to e3, and of course if d4 ever happens, then knight to c4 is strategically winning for white, and the square would be too strong. Bishop b7, d4 by white here, e4, and now Magnus goes for this position is all zeros, perhaps even slightly better for black. And Magnus goes for something that not many, even grandmasters would consider here, I believe. A very strong pawn sacrifice, which, even though it loses a pawn, gives white a practically very dominant position. He plays knight to e5, of course giving up the d4 pawn. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, rook takes e5, white has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns. But practically speaking, white doesn't have any weaknesses, and black has 2. And now after the move queen to d4, rook e7, it's very obvious that the b4 pawn is extremely weak and that the d5 pawn is weak. Of course, some tactics could work here with even queen takes e4 in some positions, knight takes here. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities, and black is definitely the one that has to look out for tactical problems, even though he is a pawn up. And I would say that the pawn doesn't really mean that much anyway. Here, Magnus plays rook a to c1. I believe he could have taken on b4, but then after d4 happens, I think black is better, so it's unwise to take the pawn here. Rook a c1, rook to d7, rook e to d1. Now d4 is stopped. For the moment, h6, rook c5, attacking the d5 pawn, rook to a5, rook takes a5, queen takes a5, h3 making luft, king to h7, rook to c1, once again challenging the open c-file, and here rook to c7 is played, and this is, believe it or not, the losing move by Fabiano. And in this position, if he plays a move such as queen to a6, just keeping the tension in the position, queen a6, let's say, rook to d1, and the position would probably go into a repetition, queen a6, rook d1. And I believe that even though I think white is visually better, black does have the extra pawn, and for the moment, all of his pieces are perfectly placed to defend the weakness. And if the b4 pawn is ever taken by the queen, then d5, d4 could cause permanent trouble in white's position, and it could even advance the e pawn to e3. And I'm not saying that that would be winning for black. I think that that would give black much more activity. And rook to c7 in this position gives white a chance to grab the pawn for free. And of course, after rook takes rook, queen takes pawn, d4, queen takes d4, and that doesn't work. So Fabiano Caruana decided to give up the b4 pawn, or give back the pawn, without the possibility of being able to play d4, and that's just a completely losing idea. So now rook takes c7, of course, queen c7, queen b4, and here Fabiano went for queen to c1 check, trying to grab the b2 pawn, but Magnus found the only defense, and that's bishop to d1. And of course the bishop is defended by the knight, the pawn is defended by the queen, and there's absolutely nothing black can do now. And these two pawns, the a pawn and the b pawn, are going to simply advance up the board, and eventually one of them is going to queen. So this position is now just busted for Fabiano, and I have to say I'm sorry for him. I mean, I like them both as chess players, and I'm not sure who I would like to see on the throne in November, but I definitely don't want the games to be as one-sided as this one, and I believe that Fabiano just made a positional blunder and lost the game because of one move. And that being rook to c7. Now bishop a6, queen to d4, bishop to e2. Now Fabiano is going to try to cause some problems for Magnus, but he won't really manage anything. King h2, bishop d1, knight d1, queen c7 check, king to g1. You can see already that it's absolutely hopeless, because the queen and the knight are blockading the black pawns perfectly, and I don't think they can advance as easily as white's pawns, and nothing is blockading the white pawns. Now queen to c1, b4, starting the push, e3. Of course, f takes e3. The pawn can simply be taken by the f pawn. Knight e4. Now queen takes d5, grabbing another pawn. Knight to d2. Another mistake. Of course, this is now blocking the defense of the knight by the queen. But there's a move. Queen to f5 check. Of course, he could have played something else. Queen to d3 would have been better, I think. But it doesn't really matter. Queen to f5 check, king to h8, now queen to g4, defending the knight. The whole position is safe. f5 played by Fabiano Caruana, trying to dislodge the queen from the defense of the knight. Of course, if the queen moves from the diagonal, then queen takes d1 is winning for black. Queen e2, knight e4, queen e1, queen a1, trying to attack the a4 pawn, but now a5, advancing the pawn one square further. Knight d6, queen to d2, this is all now just a technicality, and Magnus, of course, can easily convert this position. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Here the knights got exchanged. It's two pawns, two passed pawns on the queen side for white, only one pawn up, but clearly winning. Here Magnus is trying to improve his position and grab a couple more pawns, and he does that, of course. And now he would, of course, try to love to exchange queens and try to get rid of black's last pawn. But in some positions, there's still a possibility of a perpetual check, especially with this pawn here on f4. And you can imagine if black can get his queen here somehow and check here, king h1, queen e1 check, king h2, and Fabiano Caruana would have a draw, so Magnus still does have to be careful. Here he plays h4, making some more room for the king and aggressively approaching the black king. Queen to d6, trying to uncover a check on the king here, of course, with the move f3, and this is now just losing. But okay, this position, in this position, apparently the move h5 was plus 55 for white, but it's not really clear why, and the engines have calculated some variation 20 moves in advance. And queen to after queen to d6, the move queen to h5 check is supposed to be only plus 5, but I mean, it's still winning. King g7, queen to g5 check, a bit of repetition, probably trying to gain some more time on the clock. King h7, now once again giving a chance for Magnus to be completely winning. Now h5 is played, and now Magnus calculated correctly, perhaps he did find this variation. f3 check, of course h5 is allowing f3. g3, allowing this pawn to move forward. f2, now queen to g6 check, exchanging the queens. If black wants to do that, then of course king to g2 would stop the pawn, because the queen exchange, if queen takes queen, pawn takes queen is with check, so black doesn't have time to check here. King to h8. Now queen takes d6, of course, Fabiano Caruana didn't blunder a queen, he's getting another one. And he perhaps thought that he would have more chance at a perpetual check with a queen from f1. So queen takes d6, f1 queening, queen h6 check, but Magnus is the first one to check. King g8, queen e6, king h8, queen to e3, trying to get back to the defense. Now queen to c3 is played, king h7, g4, advancing the pawns. Of course, the whole position is safe, every pawn is defended. Queen d5, queen c7 check, king to g8, king to g3, defending the pawns. Of course, there's no perpetual checks in these positions, and in this position, and now after queen to e6, queen to d8 check, king h7, a couple more moves were played, and Fabiano finally resigned in a completely hopeless position. Of course, there's still a possibility for Magnus to go wrong, but here Fabiano Caruana trusted that the chance is completely gone. The a pawn is one square away from queening, and I believe that nobody would blunder from this position. I would just like to go back to this critical position. Wait a second, a6, c takes b4. Okay, here. First, this transition with the passed a pawn is very significant. The move a4 is, of course, the strongest possibility here after b5. So a4 is provoking black to do something. If he takes on a4, then bishop takes a4 is a strong move, pinning the knight to the rook. If Caruana doesn't take and he plays b4, then what happens in the game is the problem. And of course, Magnus has the passed a pawn. And finally this, after bishop b7, d4, by Magnus provoking the move e4, and now knight to e5. Sacrificing a pawn for a huge positional advantage and for having two clear targets in the position. After knight e5, d5, rook e5, queen d4, I would always rather have white here despite the material disadvantage. And I think this game was a great example of how strong and imaginative Magnus really is, and of course of his technical prowess and the fact that he is probably the best player when it comes to conversion of an advantage, and he rarely gives it up, and he usually even manages to convert drawn positions or sometimes even lost positions. So okay, I'm sorry for not making a video yesterday. I have a lot of work to do these days. I will catch up on that. And since the Altibox Norway has started, I'm going to cover as many games as possible. So stay tuned for more chess, and thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. Thanks very much. Bye.